So, in today's video, we're going to be talking about the Anthrocon Fursuit Parade and sort of how it relates to the lost art of fursuit performance. Now, first, let's talk about the Anthrocon Parade because I think that's something a little bit worth discussing. So, the Anthrocon Fursuit Parade drew in a lot of controversy, especially before the convention, for some rules that it had in place. And I do think that a lot of the controversy before the parade was overblown because people were sort of misunderstanding why Anthrocon did these things in the first place. Essentially, if you don't know, Anthrocon made a rule in their fursuit parade this year basically saying that you couldn't have any skin showing if you wanted to be a part of the fursuit parade. Now, there were a couple of different stories that were being tossed around. One of the first say that Anthrocon wasn't allowing poodling at all in the convention. If you don't know what poodling is, that's basically having skin showing when you're fursuiting. So if you're fursuiting and you don't have arm sleeves like this or something like that, and you're just wearing a short sleeve shirt, then that would be defined as poodling because you're letting some of your skin show. Essentially, Anthrocon said no poodling in the fursuit parade. Now, again, some people said, like, oh, well, Anthrocon isn't allowing poodling in general at the convention, which isn't true. Anthrocon never said that you couldn't poodle at the convention. In fact, I think that's really unfair to say that, oh, if you're wearing a fursuit, then you need to not be showing any skin in order to just be let into the convention. That to me feels very elitist. That to me feels very like, oh, like we're going to leave these people out. And that wasn't what they were trying to do. And the other thing that I saw being tossed around was the fact that, they were saying you could only be in the parade if you had a full suit. And that also isn't true. You have to remember that there aren't a lot of people who say there are furries that actually own a fursuit, or at least in the grand scheme of things, when you look at the percentages. I believe at this point, less than 20% of people who actually call themselves furries own a fursuit. And I can guarantee you that number gets even lower if you consider the people that only have a partial and not a full suit, like myself. And so I think that if they were saying, well, you can only be in the parade if you have a full suit, again, that would be severely limiting the amount of people that could perform. And there were a lot of people in the fursuit parade that were indeed partialing. Like, they weren't saying you couldn't partial, it's just that you had to be wearing clothes over it. And I think the biggest thing that I saw being tossed around was them saying, like, Anthrocon hates poodlers, or hates people that are partialing, or hates anyone that isn't in a full suit. And that's not really true. I had a friend that actually was on the Anthrocon staff team, and he said that really the only reason they did that was to keep numbers down. Quite frankly, Anthrocon is growing at a pretty alarming rate. There are a lot of people going, and they just don't want the fursuit parade to be 2 to 3 hours long and for people to sit that long. Not to mention that's a lot more people to manage. And so the rule was simply put in place to make the fursuit parade a little bit more manageable. But on this regard, I think this opens up the topic to a little bit of an interesting conversation, which is, in my opinion at least, the lost art of fursuit performance. Now, for me personally, when I got into this hobby, one of the things that most appealed to me was the aspect of performance. The aspect of becoming this crazy animal that could have their own personality and do their own things. It gave me a lot of hope because me personally, I loved cartoons growing up and I still love cartoons, and the idea that I could essentially be my own cartoon and share this thing with other people is awesome. And it could even be a foundation for if I ever want to do this sort of thing in the future. But for me personally, I feel like a lot of the time, especially going to Anthrocon, I feel like Anthrocon should feel like a giant stage when I feel like for me, it felt more like a giant runway. And here's what I mean by that. I feel like a lot of the time, the furry hobby can sort of be just this other form of fashion rather than this form of performance. And I'm not trying to force everybody in the fursuiting hobby to be telephone, basically, because I think that if everyone were telephone, then that would create a status quo, and then things would get boring again pretty quickly, and I really don't want that. But I do think that there is a lost art of fursuit performance in the fandom. I think that there is a lost art of just being silly and just being crazy, being energetic. And you could do this in all sorts of different ways. I should specify, I'm not saying in the fandom that we go to a Disney type sort of thing where it's like we never speak in suit and we're always 100% in character, and if you break character even once, then you're just ejected. In fact, I think that there's a lot of different ways that people can express themselves in suit. I actually think one of the best ways that people could do that is by having a voice. Now, some people might say, well, mascots typically don't speak. But if you actually dig deep into the origins of why mascots don't speak in the first place, I think that actually provides a bit more of an argument for why furries should, at least should be encouraged to try a voice. If you don't know, there's an older guy, his name was Paul Castle, and he was the old Mickey Mouse at Walt Disney World. And if you look into what he did, you can see that he actually started the role, he actually started with speaking to people as Mickey Mouse at Walt Disney World. But eventually it got to the point where Disney asked him to stop speaking because, quite frankly, he said it himself, he was not the best at replicating the Mickey Mouse voice. And if he couldn't do it, then Walt Disney didn't want any other characters doing it as well. And apparently there was even one case where someone was dressed up as Goofy and they did a big bad wolf voice, which honestly, that's understandable. But anyways, now that we talked about that and now that we understand that, why do I think that that's a reason for fursuiters to be encouraged to try having a voice in suit? Well, you have to remember that Mickey Mouse is a character owned by a company. Mickey Mouse has an established, iconic voice. And so people want to hear that. The thing is, when you have a character that's your own, like this, like say Whistler for instance, he's my own character. And so I can determine what voice he has, what it sounds like, what inflections he has. I get to determine all of that. And so people can't really tell me that, oh, you're doing the voice wrong because, well, it's my character. And I get to determine what the voice is. I think one of the things that really stood out to me at Anthrocon actually was Ronnie, hearing his voice and hearing how he did it. The first thing I thought was like, wow, he sounds like a cartoon, essentially, that was brought to life. And I think that's what makes the furry hobby special. That's what makes it what it is. The fact that we essentially are all cartoon characters that are being brought to life. Now, am I trying to discourage people that just simply want to use this as a hobby and for dress up and to use it as a fashion thing? No, absolutely not. In fact, like I said, I want to encourage people to be creative and try all of these things. Because like I said, not everyone's going to be Telephone. Not everyone's going to be Ronnie. You've got some people who have their personas as they are literally just themselves as an animal. So someone going to a con and just being themselves, not even doing any big acting or whatever, just being themselves, that is, capturing the magic of the fandom just as much as someone who goes and who plays a character and who is all super crazy and silly and stuff. And for me personally, I've learned that, I am not the big hype, crazy, silly guy. And that's okay, especially for me because, I picked a deer, and a deer as a species is definitely not that. But I think that one thing that I would encourage people to do, and other furries to do, is to consider things like what your species is, what your backstory is, how your character acts, certain character quirks and stuff. One of the big things that I think about as a deer is how I would interact with other species. Like, say, how would I interact with wolves or foxes or bears? Things that are typically aggressive towards deers. For me personally, I like to think that Whistler is at least a little bit cautious around these bigger animals. And on top of that, I've also given him a little bit of a character quirk that he is terrified of dragons. And it's these simple character quirks that can really bring your character to life, that can really help bring your character to life. I really do miss and I really do want to see more things in the furry fandom of people just becoming characters, people becoming cartoons that essentially jump off of the screen, because I think that that's what makes this hobby special. That's what makes it unique. The fact that we can become these cartoons that essentially pop off screens into the real world, into life, and the fact that we can be entertaining and fun and do this sort of thing. But I think that a lot of the time, that in the furry fandom, being sort of silly and doing all of these crazy things is a lot less common and is sort of looked down upon. And I don't think it should be that case. I think just the intent behind all of it is what is important. And I think that, honestly, there is a lot of intent that is missing in the furry fandom right now. We should at least try a little bit more to do things like be in character, Come up with a backstory for your character. Come up with character traits, character quirks, things that surprise them, things that make them happy, things that make them sad. And when you see those at conventions, go for it. Just play off of it. Just try it. See how it goes. And that's what I'm trying to encourage here. I'm trying to encourage people here to play more into their characters, be more like their characters, embrace what makes this hobby so special. And these are just my thoughts on everything. If you guys have thoughts on this, I would love to see them in the comments. Anyways, that's it from me. Thank you guys so much, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Make sure to like and subscribe, typical YouTube stuff, yada yada yada, whatever. Thank you guys so much for watching. God bless, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.